Kris Bowers is the composer of The Wild Robot. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. First and foremost, Kris, congratulations on the Golden Globe nomination from this very morning.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. Really appreciate that.
How does it feel for not just your first Globe nomination, but for this film in particular? How meaningful is that recognition?
Yeah, it's incredibly meaningful. I think, as always, it's so amazing to have the work be recognized. But I think in this instance, everyone that worked on the film just made their art from such a deeply personal place and such a place of love and excitement and curiosity and all those things across the board. And I feel like we really created this familial bond making this film. And so to make something from that place and a deeply personal place and then to have it be recognized like this is really amazing.
Yeah, and it really resonates with the subject of the film, and the film is so moving and touching for audiences, I'm sure, for the creative team making it. When you heard
Mhm.
about the project, I don't know at what point in development they were when they approached you, but when you heard about the story, or maybe read the book or saw some of the storyboards, what about the story really touched you and made you want to be a part of the project?
Yeah, so I heard about it pretty early. They brought me, fairly early on compared to it's my dog compared to other films I've been on and even animation films, just because they knew that music was going to be such a big character. And so I was on almost 2 years before we finished the project. And at first I got a call from Natalie Hayden and Mike Knobloch at Universal, who asked me if I'd be interested and sent me the book. And so my first introduction to this story and to this world was through the book. And for me, I was immediately taken just by Peter Brown's novel because I had just become a dad. My daughter was like 6 months old when I got that call. And so I remember reading the book with her and to her. I mean, she was an infant, but just very top of mind. A lot of these ideas of becoming a parent and going through that journey. And then I had my meeting with Chris and Jeff Herman, and they showed me some of their concept art. And Chris talked to me again about how much music was going to play a role in this because there wouldn't be much dialogue and the type of music he wanted to have this story hold. And then once I officially came on, they had a full version of the film that was still like storyboard animatics. And so I was able to watch the whole cut of the film as those black and white pencil sketches and start working to that.
Aside from how early on you're kind of brought in to this project, what is most unique about the work you did on Wild Robot versus, I mean, you've done such an array of different projects in your career. And this one I feel like really, from my personal point of view, stands out. Like, what is unique about your work on this that maybe you haven't had a chance to explore in other projects that you've done?
Yeah, I think a few things. Firstly, the intricate approach to orchestration and all those things. I feel like, with an animation like this, especially something where music is carrying a lot of the emotional weight in the storytelling, it requires the orchestral writing to be um, really intentional and have these subtle evolutions that are happening, every second essentially, because we're wanting to make sure that the music is following all of these amazing things we're seeing in the visuals, but we don't have dialogue to kind of allow the music to fall in the background. And the music kind of has to ride that line of being in the foreground and at the same time support what we're seeing story wise. And then with that, I wanted to find a way to meld some really unorthodox percussion with it. And so I approached this ensemble called Sandbox Percussion, and they approach percussion more in like a Foley way, where they're playing like, you know, tin cans and cups and bottles and slats of wood and metal pipes. And that I was able to write for in this similarly intricate way, almost more like modern classical music, and then have that be this ASMR layer on top of the orchestra, and then work with synth designers to make a suite of synths. And so kind of creating this interesting world and finding a way to honor the tradition of a lot of that great uh, film score writing back in the day that has these sweeping orchestral ideas and melodies and themes, but then bring it more into a modern space with the intricate classical percussion and synths. And so I feel like that approach was probably one of the biggest things I haven't been able to do in other films.
I know when I spoke to the production design team, they said that the word wild from the title really was kind of their hallmark when they were designing the world of the film, especially those kind of beautiful sweeping background painterly design. Was that an important kind of watchword for you too, like to really capture the wildness of the island in comparison to Roz, or did you have another like hallmark that you kept coming back to as you were crafting the score? Like this is what I really want to convey throughout the piece.
Yeah, there was definitely a couple of things. The wild aspect of it was something I thought about even reading the book. And then, um, what was interesting is when I read the book, I was so focused on it being this story about a robot that I had an idea of there being sense and it being really modern in that way. But then when I ended up looking at how they were approaching the visual style and reminded myself of the fact that Rod is really this singular, futuristic being that's going into this world of wilderness and into this, natural environment. That led me to think about the score needing to have much more of a natural layer that's kind of like the focal point, and having the synths be something that's a texture. And so I think leaning into the organic qualities of everything and having those organic qualities be the majority of what we're hearing with the percussion and the orchestra was a big thing. And then the other thing I'd say is something Kris and I talked about is how much this needed to be. It had to represent the warmth of this story and the warmth of who Roz becomes in this story, and this idea of kindness and kindness as a survival skill. And so I think that made me want to make sure that the music had a warmth to it and themes that could really carry that, so that we feel the growth of not only her as a character, but by the time we hear the end of the film and the score, there are these musical ideas that really land that feeling in an emotional way.
Yeah, I think that all comes across so well in the score. And something I spoke with the team about when I did a Wild Robot panel was, and you said it earlier too, the kind of lack of dialogue, especially at the beginning of the film. You really need to set up very early on just how lovable Roz is as a character. And they said it was an incredibly difficult task, but they accomplished it so well. And I think the music plays such a part in that. What kind of conversations did you have with the team about those first like pivotal moments and how to get the scoring right so that the audience is maybe on the same emotional level even before we've really met these characters in depth as we will, as it progresses?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was being mindful of perspective and who's driving the story and what ideas are driving the story in each moment. And so, thinking about Roz in the very beginning and her coming onto this island and all the things kind of attacking her in a lot of ways with the raccoons and Thorn and all of that, making sure that we felt connected with her through that entire experience in a really deep way, and making sure that honestly, I always think that melody is a big part of that musically, because it allows us to start to identify something with a character, even if it's subconscious and we don't really think about it. The first time we hear Roz's theme is when she's being attacked by all these raccoons. Actually, no, the very first time we hear it is when she turns on, and that music that's playing is her theme. And we hear it again as she's kind of, playing this commercial, trying to recruit a customer essentially. And then we hear it again when she's with the raccoons. And then the first time we hear the main theme is actually when we scan the egg and see Bright Bill. And so talking to Kris in a moment like that, for example, it's very small, but it's something where we recognize that that should be the main theme that we hear in that moment, because it's more about the beginning of their connection, and it's not specifically Roz's idea and it's not specifically Bright Bill in that moment. And so being mindful of that throughout every aspect of it, but especially in those first, 20 minutes in the movie where we have this experience with Roz and get to know this island and there's not much dialogue. A lot of it was being very intentional with what direction we were focusing on and from musically, but also at the same time, I think starting to seed those themes in a really intentional way from the very beginning allows us to help the audience track that progression.
Yeah, another really standout moment. Two tracks I want to ask you about. They kind of come sequentially. I Could Use a Boost has kind of become, the standout track on the soundtrack. It is so emotionally sweeping and grand. The orchestration is lush, and it has that incredible motif. How did you come up with that motif? Like, how did you know for those really pivotal scenes in the kind of middle and the heart of the film that you had the right motif for those moments?
Yeah, it was something that I knew I needed to tackle early. One, because it was just such a big, set piece in the movie, but it also felt like if I get that main theme right, because it felt obvious that that needed to be a moment for the main theme, then I'd be able to go back and plug it in everywhere else. And so, that was actually the second piece of music I wrote for the film. And it took us a long time. I was actually just the other day going through it, and I feel like from my first version of it to what was actually final was almost 3 months. Like it was about 2 months or so that we worked on it. And, what was interesting about the process is that when I watched it, I connected to it so much because I just become a dad, and the idea of raising someone and giving someone all of these life skills and tools to eventually just leave you one day is a pretty uh sad and scary and like bittersweet idea. And my daughter was really young at the time, like when I started writing that piece she was actually just a little over a year. I went back and looked at the timestamps the other day. I've been saying I thought she was like 6 months this whole time, but she was actually, I guess, when I started the project, but when I wrote this piece, she was a little over a year. But I remember writing this piece of music, imagining what it would be like to drop her off at college, and I shared it with Kris, and he wasn't responding to it. And he was like, "This is not the right approach." And we talked about how in that moment, what's really happening for Roz and Bright Bill is much more rife with tension, and they have this moment that's happened between them that they may never that Bright Bill may never forgive Roz for, and they might not ever see each other speak again. And so it's just a much more heavy moment. And so when we talked about that, I remember honestly looking at my daughter and starting to project myself into the future in a much different way, in a way that I didn't really want to imagine. And I realized when I felt that tension in myself, how difficult it was to think about inevitably failing her, or having something happen where she has to forgive me, or God forbid something happens where she doesn't want to forgive me and we're actually saying goodbye on those types of terms. And it was that emotional place that led me to write the beginnings of the theme that became I Could Use a Boost. And I played that for Kris, and he was like, "This is the right emotion." And then he actually encouraged me to write away from picture and continue to shape the piece that way, and that they would actually have the animation and edit follow the music. And so he just kind of encouraged me. We just continued to iterate. Like I would write a version, and at some point he pointed to like a counter melody, and he was like, "I think that's actually the theme." And so then I revised it and built off of that theme. So it was really a collaborative shaping with Kris over those couple of months.
Yeah, I wonder if is it similar process for the action sequences in the film. I mean, they're in the beginning and especially at the end, really incredible and so well edited. Those kind of action sequences, the bear attack, the egg and the fox, and then at the end, the kind of grand climax of the film. What is the key to animating those kind of fast-paced, not animating, but scoring an animated film that has these kind of fast-paced moments? I feel like it could be tricky. Are you scoring it to picture? Like, how close is that collaboration, or do you kind of have an idea, flesh it out, and then try to match it, after the fact? What's the process of doing that?
Yeah, I mean it's incredibly collaborative, and it's all to picture. I think that was the amazing thing that was great about working on this project, was that even in the animatic storyboard phase, they were so diligent with not changing too much once they had something fairly locked, that I could write to that version of it. And so, some of those action sequences I was writing to things that were, maybe in previs or maybe starting to be animated or still in storyboard, or kind of, partial with all of that. But I remember certain sequences where even with the black and white pencil sketches, they were cutting to frames that were super important. And so that kind of became my guide, creating these posts wherever I could make sure that the score was accenting those things or shifting in certain moments. And yeah, what basically was like writing to that version of it, and then as the animation came in, starting to make some different adjustments once I saw the color or the lighting change and all of that. And I'd say another big thing was approaching a lot of those action sequences as one whole piece, even if they are separate cues. Like the raccoons and the bear chase, for example, were written as two separate pieces of music, but kind of conceived as one entire suite from the time the raccoons start all the way until she discovers the egg. Where I always think about the very end of the movie, from the moment that Vantra begins to chase after them when Roz runs away from the ship. From that moment all the way until the ship leaves with Roz, it's, I forget how many minutes of music, but it's a pretty long stretch. And I wrote them as these separate chunks, but I always had to conceive them as like one whole idea. And so it was a lot of like writing the first section of it to a point where it felt like I had a good idea of the tempo and the thematic development and all of that. And then I would jump ahead to the next section so I could make sure that I was always being mindful of like the peaks and valleys and like making sure we weren't getting too big too early, and getting to the next section would cause me to go back and revise the first section to make sure that it felt like it built to the second section correctly, and then I'd have to jump to the third one. And so it was just a process of like almost like painting a mural where it was like focusing on one little moment and then stepping back to look at the whole, and going back to the one moment and doing that over and over again, and working with Kris to make sure that he could help me see how that whole thing needed to be shaped.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to say it. I know many people on the team love the migration sequence. If I had to ask them, like, what is your favorite, sequence or scene of the film? The migration sequence comes up a lot, and the rummage sequence when Ross is kind of encountering the other robots as really pivotal. Do you have a favorite sequence from the film, whether it's because of the work that you did on it, or when you kind of were able to sit back and look at the whole? Is there a particular moment that you're particularly proud of or that surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about so many of them, but one that I guess we haven't touched on that much is the first part of that migration sequence with the song "Kiss the Sky," because I feel like that really embodied so much of the collaborative approach to this. Like it was one of those meetings where I asked when I can move on to, and Mary Blee, the picture editor, basically said that they had this song from Marin and the songwriters, and that she was creating this sequence, but the sequence she had in mind was like 6.5 minutes long, and the song was only about 3 minutes. And so they asked me if I had any ideas, and what Mary had cut together was so clear emotionally that I could hear it, but she was like, I can't just copy and paste the song because that won't work. So it needs to be built a little bit more. And so I asked if Marin and the songwriters would give me the stems to the track, which songwriters fairly often don't want to give to a composer. I think there's like a lot of, preciousness with those things. And so they were so generous to give me all of the different tracks so that I could work with my music editor to cut together what I wanted that song to be throughout the 6.5 minute sequence. And decided I wanted a key change, and decided I wanted to like reharmonize it at the end, and then orchestrate around the whole thing so that I could bring in some of the themes from the score and figure out how to have the vocals kind of come in and out, and really shape this whole thing to the very clear emotional arc that Kris and Mary Blee had created. And so, once we did that and I shared it with Mary and Kris and they were excited about it, we sent it back to Mary and the songwriters, and they re-recorded everything and then sent it back to us so that we could recut it to make sure that it all worked. But that was a moment where, that song could have just been like a needle drop that you just drop in, and it's like such a separate thing from the score. And for them to invite me into that process and really trust me to figure out how to create this longer stretch to match this like intense training montage that has this like emotional climactic ending to it, felt like a really amazing thing to sit back and watch at the end.
Yeah, that montage is so seamless and so integral to the heart of the film. Kris, congratulations on The Wild Robot. Congratulations on the Golden Globe nomination. Thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Really appreciate it.